Welcome to an exciting discussion on Lesson 7.3 Working for Change. You should have read and completed the notes in class yesterday. This lesson discusses some of the changes for African Americans and women in Ohio and throughout the United States. Now, you need to know that as the movement to end slavery was going on, there was also a second movement in the United States, and that was for equality for women. So women were fighting to be equal to men. And so we're going to talk about those two movements in Ohio today. So after the Civil War, in which the Union won and slavery ended, they had to pass amendments or changes to the Constitution in order to give former enslaved people the rights that they deserved. So the first amendment that they passed was the 13th Amendment. And the 13th Amendment officially ended slavery. So slavery was still legal until the passing of the 13th Amendment in 1865. Then, in 1868, so just 3 years later, they passed or approved the 14th Amendment, which gave citizenship rights to anyone who was born in the United States. So this amendment made citizens of anyone born in the United States, including the former enslaved people. Don't forget, a citizen is someone who was born in a country or someone who had earned the rights to become a member of a country by law. So the 14th Amendment gave rights and citizenship to former slaves. Now, the 15th Amendment gave African American men the right to vote. So these three amendments were a direct result of the Civil War and the Union winning it. So as you know, most former enslaved people lived in the South. And in the South, there were few good jobs and poor housing for African Americans. They faced severe discrimination. Also, railroads, as we talked about in the last chapter, led to the growth of factories in Ohio as businesses could ship products over greatest distances at a faster speed. So in Ohio, more factories were being built which means there were more jobs. And so African Americans moved from the South to Ohio to work in these factories. By 1900, almost 100,000 African Americans lived in Ohio. But Ohio was not all rainbows and butterflies for African Americans. They faced a lot of challenges and hardships in Ohio. Even though it was a free state during the Civil War, does not mean that African Americans were treated equally. African Americans still faced discrimination in Ohio. They had low wages, and most couldn't afford to buy a house. So that is where we're at by 1900 for African Americans in Ohio. So let's talk about women in Ohio. So suffrage is the right to vote. So in the fight for equality, or being equal, women fought for the right to vote. And they also fought to gain other legal rights in Ohio, including married women couldn't own property, and only men could make family decisions. So those are some legal rights that women were fighting for. And there were some influential women in the suffrage movement. And all of these took place in Ohio. So Lucy Stone, she graduated from Oberlin College, and she was a leader in the fight for women's suffrage, or the right to vote. Next, you had Elizabeth Bisbee, and she published a newspaper called The Alliance in Columbus. And this newspaper was dedicated to women's rights, including the right to vote. Next, in this photograph, Sojourner Truth, she was formerly enslaved, and she spoke at the Akron Women's Rights meeting of 1851. And we'll talk about this meeting on the next slide, but she played a critical role in the meeting. And then you have Victoria Woodhull. She ran for president. She lost the race, but proved how far women had come. So she lost, but the fact that a woman ran for president was a big deal, and it showed how far the suffrage movement and the women's rights movement, which is one and the same, how far they have come in their work. So there were two big meetings in Ohio that dealt with women's rights. And the first one took place in Akron, May 1851. Both women and men attended this meeting. At this meeting, women gave speeches, and while these women were giving speeches, the men shouted them down. They were yelling during their speeches. The purpose was they were trying to interrupt what these women had to say. The men at this meeting feared and felt like women were taking away their rights. So they were not happy. So they kept interrupting these women. Now, Truth, who I talked about in the last slide, she gave a speech at this meeting, which kind of helped men agree to women's rights. So it kind of influenced them to look at women's rights again and to give them more and to lead that way. Now, there was also a meeting in Massillon, Ohio, and that happened in 1852. And what happened was women voted to establish the Ohio Women's Rights Association. And in this meeting, they wrote to state government asking them to pass laws giving women more rights. And then in 1861, so it took 9 years, but Ohio passed laws that allowed married women to own property and to make family decisions. But they were not able to vote yet. So, now you can move on to your next assignment. And just to let you know, I just looked it up. Women, and we'll talk about this in a later chapter, but women did not have the right to vote until 1920 with the passing of the 19th Amendment. But women are starting to get more rights at this time, especially from these women in these meetings that influence government to change their mind. Okay, so move on to your next assignment. And if you have any questions, let me know.